Ena rangatira tēnā koutou, ena tangata mai ena hauwha, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. On behalf of the organising team, good evening and a warm welcome to you all to the seminar and the public launch of the first Institute of Business Ethics report for New Zealand of the Global Ethics at Work survey, which analyses employees' perceptions of ethics in the workplace. My name is Karen Lasthuizen, and I'm the inaugural Brian Pico Chair in Ethical Leadership here within Victoria Business School. Please welcome with me Philippa Foster-Beck, who's Director of the Institute of Business Ethics in London. Philippa has 30 years of business experience, and having begun her career at Citibank and since 2001 as the Director of the Institute of Business Ethics. While Philippa was awarded for her services multiple times, she was awarded an IBE in the New Year's Honours 2006 for services to the UK Ministry of Defence, and in July 2008 was awarded the BITC Marks and Spencer Seif Award, and in New Year's Honours of 2014 she was awarded a CBE for services to Antarctic heritage. She also sits on multiple boards of the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment and around Europe. She's a visiting fellow of the Said Business School at Oxford University and honorary vice president of the Employee Ownership Association. She chairs the Antarctic Place Names Committee and is former chairman of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. And most important, maybe, she's also a member of my advisory board, of the Brian Pico Chair in Ethical Leadership. So I'm very fortunate. So Philippa is an engaged speaker on business ethics issues, and this evening she will set the scene and share the key findings of the Ethics at Work survey. As national partner for this survey, I will provide a short commentary afterwards on the specific findings for New Zealand. But please welcome Philippa.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And you're quite rightly to say that definitely the most important aspect on my CV is having the honour to be on the advisory board for Brian Pico Chair. So I do enjoy that. And sadly, of course, it's a bit more difficult for me to get to the meetings. And indeed, actually attending by phone would be probably even more difficult. You probably wouldn't want my yawning voice at the other end of the phone. But it's a great pleasure and great honour to be here this evening to just talk you through this publication that we've done and tell you a little bit about the background to it. The publication looks like this, and you will get a copy as you leave. We decided not to give you a copy so you don't leaf through everything whilst I'm talking, but you will get a copy when you leave. And the specific report for New Zealand, because this is the report for the three countries which I'm going to talk about, but the specific report for New Zealand should now be available if my staff are awake back in London, should be available on our website to download. But you'll be sent some specific details about that afterwards. So let me start by telling you a little bit about the survey. Good. The IBE first ran this survey, and you will, at the back of the publication, you will see exactly what the 14 questions are that get asked. We started this for the UK back in 2005. And the reason we did it, we were very interested to find out what was the attitude of people in work, crucial, in work, to ethics at their place of work. So something a bit different from either the internal employee surveys that companies actually send around or other organisations, because all types of organisations poll their staff to find out what they feel about these matters. But we wanted to try and get a sort of country flavour. And there were some interesting results that came out, so we thought, well, we've done it once. It's a bit much to do it every year, so every 3 years is the way that we did it. And in 2008, we then expanded and included France, Germany, Italy and Spain. So we had a sort of European view. And that is how it's been running every 3 years until this year, 2018, where we've gone completely berserk, as some people might say. We've gone from 5 countries to 12 in one leap. I was very keen to include New Zealand and Australia. I've been coming down to this country now for 9-10 years, every year, sometimes twice, and getting a feel for how this whole topic of an interest in business ethics has changed over that time. And I felt, we're doing this survey, it's time to ask these questions over here as well. And of course the same for Australia. The other countries that we've added in this year, in a wider range within Europe, we've added in Ireland, Switzerland and Portugal, and through our Swiss partner, the equivalent of the Brown Pico chair here, we've also added in Canada and Singapore. So it's a little bit of an eclectic mix of the world. So I can't really say it's global, but there's a reason for every country. And so that is basically what the survey is. So it's understanding here than the purpose. As I said, the employees' attitudes to ethics at their place of work. Very crucial to take that and to track developments over time. And this comparison, which I'm going to do for New Zealand, Australia and the UK. I've mentioned about 3 years. We've been doing it with ComRes, which is sort of research organisation, but in the UK, and that does come out in the report that you will actually see, because you've got the UK figures in there, we changed the methodology from being face-to-face to being online, which matched the other countries and how we were polling them. And there is a difference, and one can see it, and the pollsters told us that there is a difference when you ask a question face-to-face, like have you seen any misconduct or in your place of work during the last 12 months. The tendency, if you're actually being asked that face-to-face, is almost to say no, almost out of loyalty. But if you're asked to answer that question online, you tend to say yes. And we have seen some switches around in that, and that was something that we were told to expect. So that's a few details at the bottom there about the respondents across the 3 countries. So let's turn now to some of the figures. And the first thing we're going to look at about corporate culture. Assessing an ethical culture is absolutely essential to understanding the role that ethics plays in an organisation. The risks abound for employees, particularly of those who feel pressured to compromise ethical standards, and that actually comes out in some of the data. So one of the crucial questions that actually comes up as question 2, but I'll come back to question 1, but is how often is honesty practiced at work? So these are the individual country figures for the 3 countries, giving an overall average of 84%, which certainly doesn't look too bad. Above 80%, I think, is good. UK only just gets over 81 up there. But it's quite interesting when we compare to the group of 8 European countries. We did publish that report back in July, and that again is free to download on our website. The equivalent European average is 78%, 6% different. And the lowest, I wonder if anybody can guess which country in Europe that might fall to, but I was very surprised when I read it. But the lowest where people feel that honesty practiced at work, Germany, 69%, which I found as a real sort of eye-opener when looking at this, and that's the joy of actually and the fun of what comes out of these surveys. So. Then for the German partner, whom we've been working with this, I think they found it a real revelation in terms of that. So matching up this sort of how often is honesty is practiced, we then also look back at where question 1, which was actually about questionable practices. and where there might be a disconnect. I mean, does it infer a potential inability of employees actually to see the ethical dimension of day-to-day behaviours and give rise to ethical blindness if, in these sort of some of the key points out of question 1, is how do you feel about pretending to be sick to take the day off? Now, I launched this in Sydney yesterday morning, and of course, as soon as they saw Australia at 20%, they all shouted out the audience, "Take a sickie." So they were actually quite proud that they were so far advanced on this. But these sorts of questions, and you can see them in black there, minor fiddling, exaggeration of travel expenses, favouring family or friends when recruiting, making personal phone calls from work and posting personal mail from work. These are the sorts of things that come up in our question 1, which are literally testing, how do you feel about these sorts of things? Because they can be an indicator. If people don't care about these little things, if they're not being picked up at work, or the attitude it doesn't matter, how far will that dial go? Will it slip? Will ethical blindness begin to set in, and actually these little things become the big things? So it's something to be aware of. Now, just to give you some comparisons again, let's go back to minor fiddling and exaggeration of travel expenses. Here you can see the average across these 3 countries was 11%. Across the European 8, it was 15%. So people more relaxed about it in Europe. And although not as high, Germany came out top there at 9%. So again, Germany there. And then favouring family or friends when recruiting or awarding contracts, the European average was at 19%, so a bit higher. And France came in, they were the surprise country. 30% of respondents thought it was perfectly okay to do this. So it does show you there's some really different issues coming out in the different countries. So if we look then perhaps at managers' attitudes and how they play out, you can see here the responses to these 3 questions about petty fiddling is inevitable in a modern organisation. These are the country results for Australia and New Zealand. You can see the differences, if we crack down on every fiddle, we'd soon find we had no staff. And the last one, acceptable to artificially increase profits in the books as long as no money is stolen. That, I have to say, is the most worrying thing for managers to actually be saying. And it just throws up what's going on. So if we move on to the next section about influencing corporate culture, it's very important for an organisation to have a supportive environment, because if it is, it will aid the development and maintenance of that corporate culture. And one thing, of course, corporate culture is, you have to remember, it's a journey. It's a journey with no end, because it gets reinforced by every new employee that comes in and joins the organisation. So picking that up, their journey begins, does mean that you have to reinforce your own journey as an employer to show to them, and they understand, that what behaviours and standards are expected of them. And a key component of that, as we have identified at the IBE, is having some form of overarching ethics programme, which is actually made up of 4 key points and components as we described it unfortunately back in 2005, whereas today we would slightly design it a bit differently, but you know what it's like. If you change a questionnaire, you lose all your trend data. So change it at your peril, as it were. But these are the 4 points that we picked up at that time: having written standards of ethical business conduct, providing employees with a means of reporting misconduct, that's what we would call as speaking up, providing training on standards, and then having some sort of advice or information helpline. And I think that is probably the question that we would slightly change if we were able to. So these are the results from the respondents across the 3 different countries. And I can throw in also the European averages for each of these questions. So for the first one, my organisation's written standards of ethical business conduct, in Europe the figure as a combined figure was a bit lower at 59%. Organisation provides employees with reporting, much lower at 43%. And my organisation provides training, even more low at 39%. So you can see there's a common cultural issue, I think, between our 3 countries about approaches to this and how far advanced we are over some of the European countries. And then the final one about having an advice line is even lower at 33% across Europe. So they're quite important things to tease out, because the correlations that come out about organisations that actually have some form of ethics programme are really quite startling. So, and this is what I'm talking about. So, organisations with an ethics programme, employees say that, and it's picking out those who say we've got a supportive programme. Honesty is practised more frequently. 89% to 77%, i.e. those who don't feel that they have an ethics programme. Organisation acts more responsibly with its stakeholders, a very important element in today's environment, particularly when you're discussing about business's role in society. 85% versus 54%. Willing to speak up, and this is one of the killer facts, if they become aware of misconduct, 79% versus 32%. So they're really quite important issues, and that is when you get to see the publication in full, and indeed look at the New Zealand results in detail, you'll see how important these correlations are. So when we talk about a supportive environment, these are the 3 main aspects about it. The tone from the top, is also, of course, example, that stakeholder engagement I've just referred to, and addressing misconduct. And that is, the bottom one is the ability of an organisation to discipline employees who violate its ethical standards. Do employees feel in their place of work that bad behaviour is disciplined? The actual results for New Zealand was that 53% did, so it was only just over half, slightly more in the UK and Australia, both at 59%. So, again, looking at these correlations about us having a supportive environment, you're getting to see what the format is here. But if you've got an supportive environment, employees say that honesty is practised more frequently, 94% versus 63%. You can see how this all begins to hang together, and I think that these sort of stats, for anybody who is doubtful about the business case for engaging with this as a subject, I think we have some facts and figures here to support it. Awareness of misconduct, you can see there, very low at 20% versus 52%. Willingness to speak up, and the pressures to compromise. I think that's another area that is quite important. So if you're working in an office where it is supportive, people are more aware of that there might be a time pressure, therefore they might give you a bit more time, and you're not being asked to be right up against it all the time and take decisions without that opportunity to reflect and think, actually, is this right? Should I be doing this? Particularly in those high-pressure sales environments. You could think, take an example, not in this part of the world, but just look at the Wells Fargo case when the pressures that were on staff to write new bank accounts, leading sadly to some people actually taking their lives because they couldn't hit the targets. But at the same time signing up their every single relative that they had, and indeed some signed up their pets to meet this particular target. And that's what, pressures, they never had that time and never reflected, could they actually say this isn't right? Which brings me on to the next key area, which is all about speaking up. And the chapter 2 in the publication picks up this whole topic and explaining why it is so important. So let's just unpick this for a second. Misconduct at work. The first question that goes around this particular point was, are you aware of having seen a matter of concern, ethical violation is how we shortened it, in the course of the last year? So 26% in New Zealand said they had, and 24. What type of misconduct had you seen? And these are the top 3 that came out. People treated inappropriately or unethically, bullying, harassment, and safety violations. So the next question that comes out of that is, well, if you've seen that, did you actually report it? Did you speak up about it? And this is where this is the percentage of people that did not report. So you can see over a third of people having seen something wrong did not do anything about it. Why didn't they? I felt it might jeopardize my job. I did not believe that corrective action would be taken. I felt I might alienate myself from my colleagues. And those were the combined figures across the 3 countries. And as I say, you'll be able to see the detail for each country when you see the reports. So, okay, so those people who did report it, good. Next question is, were you satisfied with the process of that speaking up? And here you can see Australia, obviously very satisfied, and the people who did that there. New Zealand, not quite so, down at 55%. And again, we talked about whether or not this is for all respondents rather than just managers, about whether or not the organisation disciplines people who violate those ethical norms, as it were. So let me now turn to 2 key points that are mentioned in our summary and conclusions for the New Zealand report. So the first was around SMEs. Now, of course, in this country, there is a very large proportion of small and medium-sized organisations versus large ones, and also there's a large privately owned, family-owned company sector compared certainly to the UK versus those who might be listed. So what we were looking at here my line managers support me in following my organisation standards of ethical behaviour, and when you come to see the report, you'll see that we do pick out in the sidebars some data around gender, some data around age, and some data around the types of organisations, SMEs or large organisations. And so this is just picking up that area. So you can see the difference in each of these questions about smaller companies and larger ones. I think it's the second one, honesty is always practiced in my organisation. I found that counterintuitive. My feeling was that in small organisations, you can understand why it's more acceptable to favour family or friends, but the nature of it. But honesty being practised, one always thinks that perhaps the coherence, the culture of those smaller organisations is perhaps more resilient, and therefore perhaps honesty would be practised more frequently in the respondents' idea. So that was a bit of a surprise to me. And the second conclusion we made around New Zealand was about whether or not managers are actually setting the example they should be. And here we just pick out some of the data from employees' views of their managers. And I think the bottom one there, my manager, it's always a worrying one, this, my manager rewards employees who get good results, even if they use practices that are ethically questionable. And it is surprising across all the countries how high that figure that is, and quite worrying. So it's business at all costs, and I think that is something that all employers should be aware of. Are they setting realistic targets? I go back to the Wells Fargo case. So these are some concerns that we have picked out from the way that the data has been correlated. And so, saying that fiddling with expenses is acceptable. You wouldn't expect your managers to be saying that. And we enter this age issue here around millennials managers' views versus sort of middle managers and then older managers. But there's quite a lot of data in that. So I thought, just out of fairness, as I was doing this the other way around yesterday in Australia, I'll do Australia too, just to pick out a couple of things there that came through in their report. And there we were picking up about incentives to ethics. Are they common? And so less than a quarter, as you can see there, offer incentives. Now, incentives doesn't have to be money. It's a way, it's the use of the word perhaps, but it's actually a way of raising awareness in more formal appraisals, as you can see, or in bonus, whether or not people and organisations are actually building in how you do your job as well as just doing your job. And that's really what this is looking at. And whether or not they actually work. We have this counterintuitive one again about at the bottom there about the questionable practices, the same as I just alluded to, but the rate there is higher, and the compromising as ever that goes on. But it's always interesting asking about, do employees feel responsible for ethics? And this goes back to the point about those who didn't raise issues. And it's just a little bit worrying that perhaps the level of people who feel that it's my responsibility too, it's not just those who are running the organisation, it's everybody's responsibility in terms of seeing that the organisation does work ethically. So I rest my case there on the dates and look forward to hearing from Karen about what she's pulled out of looking at the New Zealand specific report. So thank you.
Thank you, Philippa. Raises probably quite a lot of questions. The most important question then is, how do we do? And we already have seen that we are better than Europe. That's good. But of course, that's not the real question, is it? How do we do? Hooray! So let's go continue to say what it really means. But it seems that we are, and maybe in some respects, slightly better than our Australian neighbours. But then the question is, will we be fine? And when we look at the Ethics at Work survey findings, and I will reflect a bit more broadly on these results and not just sort of give you another percentages after percentages, because I think it's to get the key message there. So, but a quarter of New Zealand employees have been aware of misconduct during the past year, including behaviours like indecent treatment, the waste and abuse of organisational resources, and theft or fraud. That would say, and it's not completely fair to calculate it that way, but it would say that 2.5 million workers in New Zealand, that it implies, or it could imply, that 630,000 people have been aware of unethical behaviour at work. Of course, it's possible that we all are looking at the same elephant here. That might be bullying, maybe, or people treated unethically or inappropriate, as we have seen score highest. But still, think about it. So it's always, when you come into these percentages, think, 60%, 70%, that's quite good. But it also means that the 10% that says that we don't have anything at all. So that would be 250,000. And when people say we don't have a code of conduct or written standards that provide guidelines for the job, it means maybe not even that organizations don't have that guidelines, but people don't know it, right? And that remembers me also in the Netherlands, we do have those codes of conduct, but when you're employed or when you start, nobody gives you the code of conduct, so people say, well, yeah, probably we'll have one. And it might be here the case sometimes as well. So what is the point of having a code of conduct if you don't make people aware of the fact that you do have one? But maybe more concerning is that there's often no advice or helpline to get advice about behaving ethically at work. And we all know how good it is if you can just talk to people face to face. Because every dilemma is maybe different from the other, and maybe it's not. Maybe it's a dilemma, but it's maybe nothing wrong yet. So it's something that you just want to raise your concern, you want to discuss with someone, and then there's no helpline, or it's not clear. I try to find. Sometimes when I look on websites, say, well, maybe what can I find on phone numbers, and it's difficult. So hopefully it will be on intranets, but even then. No training on standards of ethical conduct, and no means of reporting misconduct confidentiality. So when you look at the numbers of people that work, it means that there's still a lot of room of improvement. And that brings me to our research that we did here, and I talked to 40 experienced leaders in New Zealand when I started here 2 years ago. So, well, maybe I should talk first, because it's not just what's going wrong, but also it might be culture specific, what the reasons are. So I spoke to, for instance, Kirsten Patterson, and she said, well, the main ethical issue is, are we doing enough to talk about it? And are we doing enough to reinforce the right behavior to ensure that we are not becoming complacent? So, and then Stephen Walker says, it's important to talk about how we deal with things when they go wrong. That's also part of having an open conversation on ethics. And I think both things are sort of really important. Are we doing enough to talk about it, to reinforce the right behavior? But do we actually also talk about things that are going wrong? Or are we just sort of, wow, that's a rotten apple, just get rid of that rotten apple, and then we continue? Well, it might be that there is a broader issue in the ethical culture. So I couldn't agree more than with Suzanne Snively that the first risk for New Zealand is that ethics is not a priority, and it should be number one, because we are number one in the world, our global ethical reputation, and we put it at risk if we just think, that will stay that way. And we all know that the world is changing. And there's more technology, there's more trade, and we have the millennials also becoming part of the workplace, and it means that they want to have their say as well, right? And we need to think about what it means when we have more diversity, because people are, like myself, come to New Zealand with the idea to stay here. So it's a sort of, you get diversity in workplaces, which is awesome, but it also says something about, well, then values are maybe not all the same anymore. So I agree, we should sort of see if we can have a more proactive approach. And one of the reasons is not just the ethical reputation, but from research it shows that the serious corruption cases often have started with these minor offences within an organisational culture without clear norms. We had some big cases, and I now make sort of always this joke that it seems that we had quite a few big issues with fraudsters and corruption since I arrived here. So that might be the case, but it says something about this organisational culture. If we don't work on that, it might be that we just be surprised by a big case that we are really we are not familiar here with that sort of cases that we think that's only happening in Italy, for instance. Right, Francesca? Yeah. Good. So it means that if we broaden our scope a bit, then we're looking at a sort of typology of different kind of behaviors, like not just corruption and bribing and fraud and theft, that might be our natural focus. But also look into those that sort of the barrel, like favoritism or conflicts of interest through gifts and sideline activities. And I think that what makes the papers today, the newspapers, is also these indecent treatment, discrimination and sexual harassment. And I think it has to do that we sort of now really maybe become more committed to address those issues. So you always get this first beginning, we call it the integrity paradox. The more you look, the more you will find. And then it seems to become all more worse than it was. But actually it's a good sign. So I think it's good that we are starting to think about, so what is actually that defines this barrel? to make sure that we are not being surprised in the future with not just that our workplaces maybe even become worse, but I think it would be quite disastrous when we also lose our good ethical reputation. So, to wrap it up, so how does it work? How can you build on the supportive work climate? So, of course, as a Brian Picker Chair in Ethical Leadership, I do believe that leadership is an important factor. But luckily, it also shows from research that leadership is very important, setting this tone. So, what you see here is a sort of, when we think about leadership as, well, we have role modeling, which is very important. And then we have the reinforcement of things, so you have to reward good behavior and basically discipline bad behavior. And we saw from the figures that Philippa told us about that this bad side, or sort of addressing concerns, that might be a bit at odds with your way of doing things. Maybe we are thinking we are fine, or maybe we just find it very difficult to go into this more confrontational discussions. And we also have the Dutch embassy here, or a few works. We know that from the Netherlands, we are more like, not passive-aggressive, just aggressive, so we just go for this confrontational approach. But it does mean that sometimes you put it on the table, right? And that might be a problem here. So you have those three factors, and it seems that reinforcement from ethical leadership means that people feel that they can join and report ethical issues, because they do something and it is followed up by a real result. So it makes sense to report. And then in the end, you will see that also the unethical behaviors might decrease. Communication, if you have a lot of discussion and an open ear also to ethics issues, it means that you create support in this wider environment. And it also leads to less misbehavior. And the most important factor is role modeling. We just look at our leaders, how do they do it? And that's why we can't have sort of exceptions for leaders, because then it says, well, yeah, it maybe is important, but actually, they are crossing that fine line sometimes as well. Because role modeling is giving us clarity about the norms, what they mean in practice. And that means that you sort of really nurture this ethical climate, and then people can start discussing, oh, that's interesting, these are my sort of my ideas about how we should go about these issues. And to wrap up, so Rob Everett said ethical leadership is about ethics being very core to everything and not added on, and it's about demonstrating those beliefs at every possible opportunity. And that last part, to demonstrate those beliefs at every possible opportunity, that's something that we need to do. And it is a bit sort of, oh, me talking about ethics again. Well, I am in that position, so I know where you're coming from, but still, to make sure that we talk about those issues, we are not easily talking about dilemmas or problems. We should do that, because it worries me quite a bit that managers in New Zealand are more likely to feel those pressures, and that they are more likely to say that maybe because of those pressures, they are willing to change the results to make it look more positive, maybe to make their performance look more positive. And although it's still too early to say what it means that millennial managers have more lenient attitudes to questionable practices, and luckily enough I will get some data to do some additional analysis into this. But that's a very interesting finding, but also a bit concerning one. So, what are we good in ethical leadership in New Zealand? I would say we are very good to go for this relational approach, and that has to do with that we are small and remote, we know each other, so we're good in building relationships and to motivate people by just being us, right? To go with people and just catch up, and role modeling ethics, high personal integrity, and that's the way we do things. But what we do miss is those on the other side, the one who's setting boundaries. And say, well, and not just setting boundaries, also get that extra step when you cross those boundaries, that you will be disciplined. The honest feedback. Lynn Provost said before, we are not the country from the honest feedback, so we are more like the avoidance culture. I think that might be true, and it can become a problem, right, in the future. So that's the boundary setter, and most important, also as a baseline, the safe haven creator. If you don't feel safe to report, then you won't, basically, and that's also what the results show that might be the case. And what we need on top of that is just this practicing preacher that gives proactive and explicit communication, is doing something around ethics and integrity, putting it on the agenda, and make sure that we have teaching and mentoring. So basically, that's what I would like to say. And, well, if there are questions, both on what I said in the last few minutes, but basically also for the presentation that Philippa just gave about the results, then please do so.